much, Ivana. We're really excited to be here, panel number 2. So panel number 2 and panel number 4 are united in a conversation around sustainable design. What we're going to talk a little bit about today in a conversation is more around structural and infrastructure connections to design. So I'm going to start off by asking my fabulous group of panelists to talk a little bit about the elements of design, because there's so many different pieces that have connections into sustainability and that we have work to do in order to make sure that we find them to be as sustainable as we want them to be. And so I'd like them to talk about an element of design and a sustainability component to it, particularly with an infrastructure flair. I think that there is so much conversation right now about the need for deploying infrastructure, certainly that we're seeing in the States as well as globally. But just to bring it home to Detroit and to Southeast Michigan for a second, one of our challenges here is rooted in one of our opportunities, which is our deep history. And because of that history and because of the early build of this beautiful city, we have, in some cases, some undersized infrastructure. And so we really do have some needs. And some of the projects that are represented here today are examples of moving that forward. And I think there are other things that we might not all be aware of yet that are ideas in the making. So with that, I'm actually going to start down at the far end, and Frans, hand it to you first. If you'd like to talk a little bit about a project that you're working on connected to an element of design you'd like to highlight in the infrastructure space.
Luckily, I have a couple of these projects, but one of the nice projects that we're working on is a project in San Francisco. Bay Area, what you see, of course, is that water, especially with climate change, really becomes a problem at the moment, and we really need to think about it. How do we, first of all, retain water? How do we mitigate water? And what we did but also how can we use water? So what we did here, we worked actually together with 4 other architects on one master planning. We raised the zero level to make sure that we were above sea level rise, so that we already were, say, looking into the future to make sure that everything that we're going to construct and everything that we're going to build there is safe for sea level rise. But what we also did is we used, for example, the bay water in a bay water plant to do all the electricity or all the hot and cold water for all the buildings that we're doing there. So it's not that every building has its own systems, but with the 12 buildings that need to be constructed over the coming 10 years, we're already looking at the infrastructure for all these buildings in the first buildings. So there's a black water plant in one of the buildings of Work AC. In our building, we have the DES, the district energy plant. Just so working together so that we can actually, all of us, profit from these bigger investments.
Well, I like all those threads of climate, water use, and collaboration in order to move us forward. Ryan?
I would lift up transportation. So when we think of the District of Detroit, the I-75 corridor cuts right through it. And I think Detroit was no exception to the cities that were devastated when the highways in the 60s really divided and destroyed largely in majority black cities. Detroit, no exception. How are communities affected when those highway systems kind of rip through the cities? And how do we use the moment now where you have a historic federal commitment to repair cities? There's a program called Reconnecting Communities that has $3 billion in it. We have been part of an effort that the Downtown Detroit Partnership has led to fight for that funding to come to Detroit instead of other cities. And specifically right on our footprint around the buildings, there's a plan for an overbuild over I-75. So you come up Woodward right now in Detroit, there's a beautiful kind of street wall experience that really falls away when you come close. So this, when it gets to sustainability, we think of as an environmental justice issue, right? This is an issue where highways have cut up the city and divided the city. 375 is a whole other topic, right? It destroying communities, Black Bottom, Paradise Valley. So how is that a moment now of opportunity where you're thinking of green lanes and by green rails to trails, bike lanes, the 2nd Avenue Greenway, potentially coming up into Beacon Park and other areas that connect the waterfront, just like this building here is connected to the Riverwalk through a trail, green trail. How can we look at the opposite of what the highways did years ago, dividing our cities, and reconnect them with greenways, bikeways, and trails, and even repair the highway damage? So a park or a greenway that spans I-75, we've been supporting with funding and design work that project, and I hope it wins when Detroit competes against Dallas and others who are fighting for these kind of overbuild structures that are a big part of conversation now when you look at healing the damage that we did with our highway system. So I'd love to add that to the conversation today.
Yeah, that's an important conversation, and the connectivity to so many different issues, particularly cultural. Jonathan, your work touches on that transportation component in particular too. Can you talk a little bit more about the bridge and about the work there?
Yeah, so what's happened at Gordie Howe International Bridge, just to add on to what Ryan was saying about transportation, is the project has incorporated a multi-use paths for pedestrian and cyclists to connect the Windsor and the Detroit area, and also the infrastructure around the point of entries have all been, money's been put into the sidewalks and infrastructure for safe pathways to connect the two communities across the bridge. So it's an important thing to connect the international communities between Windsor and Detroit.
And of course, bridges over water. And Matt, you and I were chatting a little bit before we got out here, but I'm really intrigued by your coastal resilience work because water is such an important, it's a molecule of life for all of us, but also changing so much because of the way that our weather's changing due to climate, which has dramatic impacts on built environment already and how we're thinking about future and future build.
Yeah, for sure. So again, thanks for having me here. I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience in working in New York City. Many of you are probably aware of the Big U vision for rebuilding the waterfront in Lower Manhattan after the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy in 2012. We've been fortunate enough to be planners, designers, and architects for the subsequent implementation for those investments. And so it's been a really amazing opportunity for New York City to really not only make itself more resilient to coastal flooding, but also rethink its relationship to the water itself. And so in many cases, that means rethinking the waterfront parks, making sure that they're being developed and prepared for the next generation of users, but also looking at how that waterfront can better serve the transportation assets of the city. So this also means rethinking the ferry system for New York and potentially reconstructing and making the ferry terminals more adaptive, and as well as creating more capacity for other uses along the waterfront, namely waterborne freight and other aspects of the water that in the last several generations have been lost due to, say, building coastal highways and other types of infrastructure. So we've been working with the several city agencies in implementing these projects and seeing them from initial concept to construction. And we're happy to report that certain elements are already constructed today, and we're seeing that through. And so it's really exciting.
Yeah, that is really exciting. And, you know, it brings to mind for me something that I think is evolving over time in the States as well as around the world. We're using our waterways differently, right? So the way that we initially built, particularly if I think about it from a Michigan perspective, it much more, it's not really industrial, but like use space, economic use space for our waterways. And that still exists. But I think that particularly when I think about it from a Detroit perspective, we're having more conversations about being able to touch and feel and it be in the water, interact with the water. I'm kind of curious, Matt, for you and for others, how you think about that and how that change in our use is impacting design work that you do.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think maybe I'll get more specific to one example, is that we're developing a plan for the pictures aren't up there anymore. I was going to point for Lower Manhattan to extend the shoreline of Lower Manhattan and raise the shoreline edge by over a full story height, almost 15 feet higher than the current waterfront edge is today. And of course, the biggest question is, what does that mean to your relationship to the water itself? And so we have to find ways to create multi-level experiences to make sure that you're creating a higher edge to protect people from coastal storms and sea level rise, but also give that opportunity to get people closer to the water and ensure that that is still there. And so we've been really working closely with the community to make sure that we find these kinds of areas where people can get closer and experience the water even more than they do today.
And so, Jonathan, from your perspective, it's a little bit different because it's crossing the water, right? But you absolutely have to think about kind of the use space from the river perspective in the design work of the bridge. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, the use space with the multi-use paths, just the ability for someone to cycle across the river, just to see the waterway, as well as walking across. I mean, I think currently the Ambassador Bridge you cannot walk across, and so it's a real important thing for just the collaboration of pedestrians and cyclists to be able to see the waterways and approach it, and then cross the international borders. So,
Ryan, I know that Related thinks a lot about these sort of topics on all of your types of builds. How are you thinking about connecting into water and other angles of the things that we've laid out here?
I think in Detroit, the biggest investment that we've made to date is our founder, Stephen Ross, gave a $100 million commitment to the University of Michigan, which I know Liesl is a part of now, and that team to build an innovation center, University of Michigan's Innovation Center, which could be breaking ground this year here. That's going to focus, I think, as one of its leading edges around climate tech and these ideas of, Michigan has 1% of the Earth's surface water. This is a place of tremendous leadership on climate infrastructure, but on resiliency when it comes to carbon capture, climate tech. One of the degrees they're going to be offering from the C School there, and master's, is that Michigan has announced is around sustainability and just transition. So being in this extraordinary space where we are today brings that to mind to me. We're not going to get to net zero. We're not going to get where we need to be without innovation and without technology, and that has to be driven by our great universities, by our great cities, the economic development muscle of Detroit combining with the research muscle of Ann Arbor is an extraordinarily exciting project. So when I think of water, I think of the innovations that come out of that, that help us clean our water, help us clean our air, and help us kind of as a city, not just look to the past as the motor city, but to the future, right? As the EV city, the battery transition and storage, all these areas that we can and should lead in. And I think that's been at least our biggest direct investment here to date.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Very excited about that interplay between climate and water and the innovation that's necessary to move us forward. So Frans, I was wondering from your perspective, lots of innovation, lots of conversation about Detroit and about the states. And I know you're doing a lot of work here, but curious when you think about that innovation component, where you would share a little bit from your project's perspective.
Maybe not only from a project's perspective, but maybe from a Dutch perspective, because we thought that we had solved our problem. We had a big flood in 1953. We had the Delta plant. We end of the 80s, we solved it. Our land was protected. But then we actually saw that the rivers were at certain moments were getting higher and higher. We actually didn't have a problem from the sea, but we have a problem from our backland. So we solved that, raised our dikes from the rivers. But now what we're actually seeing is that there is less rain, less water and snow falling in the Alps. And that means that actually now during spring and summer, we actually have droughts in the Netherlands. And we need to capture this water again. That we have spent millions of dollars making sure that we can get the water out of our country as fast as possible into the sea. And now we're actually trying to redesign our country actually that we can keep it. And so we are designing parks with tidal waves, where in the winter and we actually try to keep the water that we can then use it later. And that you also see in our projects that, we need to include green roofs, so that at least you have 2 or 3 inches of water on your roof that you always need to keep to make sure, first of all, heat mitigation, making sure the climate in the city becomes better, but also that that you have this water inside the city that you can use for the plants, and that you don't always have to use, say, clean water to water your plants. So you see that our relationship with water is constantly changing. And actually, that's something that you also see now around the world, that while we were first trying to always push it away, we now need to start living with water. And we also, especially in coastal cities, but also here along the river, you need to start thinking, in 50 years, what will the water do? And how can I make sure that the buildings that I'm building, should these float? Should I make sure that the water can actually protrude the land more instead of pushing it away, just making sure that the water can come into the land, but it comes in without being a bother. Because now, for example, here in Detroit, we know 2 years ago, or I think it was, you had like 6 inches of rain. The whole inner city was covered. You couldn't drive your car anymore. How do we start rethinking and using the water that's there so that you store it and that you use it in a later moment? But also, if there's a lot of water, make sure that there is spaces where it can go to. I mean, look at the Detroit downtown. If you look from Google Earth, the biggest green patch there is the America Stadium. That's actually the only green that there is almost. So yeah, if there is water, where does it go? How can you store it and how can you use it?
Yeah, I definitely think that we're thinking about our relationship to water in a different way, particularly as we're having so many different weather events that we have to get adapted to. Matt, I actually want to come back to you because I have the feeling that you think a lot about the way that we're changing influence around water and how we relate to it. And I'm curious, in your role, you talked a little bit already about some of the intricacies, but I'm kind of curious if there are specific examples of projects where you're dealing with coastal resilience because of these changes. As you said earlier, it's not just Michigan, it's everybody that's on the coasts.
Yeah, and I think I'll also expand that a little bit, because I think one of the major lessons in the context of New York that we've been learning is that since 2012, there's been a hyper focus on trying to prepare for the next hurricane. Since that time, we've seen just so many deluges of heavy rainfall events that realizing that rainfall is really impacting the city on a much more regular basis at this point. I think maybe a good example is just a few weeks ago, I was actually going to the subway to go to the office to meet about stormwater management plan for Lower Manhattan when I found myself wading through ankle-high water that was cascading down the hill in Brooklyn, and then didn't make it to the office because the subway was flooded and the entire train system paused. And this was completely even unexpected in terms of weather reports. This was a 500-year rain event that happened completely unexpectedly. And so what the city needs to be doing and is doing now is starting to act much more quickly and rethinking, okay, we're going to see these more often. As you were saying, where is all of this water going to go? How do we rethink our infrastructure as quickly as possible and rethink how the climate is going to affect the city? And what we've been doing is working with the mayor's office and going neighborhood by neighborhood and evaluating where the opportunities are for storing more rainwater within the community itself. And not only looking at it from an infrastructure perspective, but also looking at it from a community perspective in what are the needs for that neighborhood and how can you align the billions of dollars that are going to need to be built in order to make the city more resilient for stormwater and also make it a better place for people to live.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, they say don't ask a question you don't know the answer to. So I don't know the answer to this question. But Jonathan, I got to imagine in working on the Gordie Howe development, you talked a little bit already about how many collaborations there were that were part of it. I'm curious how changes to water, like were there conversations about resiliency and about the changing water events as you all were doing the planning work for the Gordie Howe Bridge? Or is that something that just sort of, was, it already kind of baked in? I guess I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was baked in, but there was a lot of upfront planning with different communities, with City of Windsor, City of Detroit, and outlying areas, just to understand what stormwater events and how we can control the water, holding water on site and then as long as possible, and then also incorporating bioswales onto the site. But there was a lot of discussions. It was kind of baked into the overall project in regards to what sustainability requirements would be required for the overall project. And it's one thing to, it's a P3 project, and as part of the contract, all these things were incorporated into the contract. But it's one of these things where us as designers, we need to kind of encourage the owners to put these requirements inside the contract, so then the designers have a kind of a fighting chance to help with sustainability.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Ryan, I know Related does a ton of this kind of work, and you think about the complexities of sustainability in many of the projects. We've talked a lot here about adaptation, but I know you also do work on the mitigation side, on the energy side. But I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about that.
I want to bridge the conversation with economics. And I think we sometimes have these conversations separately, where you're having an economic development conversation, then you're having kind of a climate conversation. And I think, especially when it gets to Detroit, and what Frans mentioned with the flooding here, that was, District 4 and basements flooding. Actually, several years we've had this challenge. And how do we view that also as an economic opportunity, right? How do you bring in companies who are helping solve that, and that's job creation? How do you help us pivot into that? That is, when we look at our work in New York, actually in Cornell Tech, it's one of the innovation centers we're modeling, and University of Michigan is modeling after. We helped build that building. I think it's one of the first passive house in New York City, the Bloomberg building that's there. There's some innovations there, but what the idea of that was, when Michael Bloomberg initially had the competition for an applied science campus to come to New York, the idea was to diversify the New York economy away from media and finance into more tech and some of the green tech. And there's these innovation hubs that have done that. And so what I see when you're trying to think of wealth building and wealth creation, it's not just, and I know C School at U of M has a Detroit clinic that's helping already. It's already on the ground helping people mitigate flood conditions, air quality in southwest Detroit. Some of the worst air quality in the state is here. So those negative harms is one way to approach it, but there's the positive harms, like ideas of community solar, right? People owning power and growing wealth by using kind of climate tech and technologies. And I think that's what we've seen in New York. I mean, or Amazon, last thing I'll say on this front, the idea in Michigan, this concept of an innovation hub, or it can be focused on green tech, got started when Michigan was not in the conversation for Amazon's second headquarters, Amazon's HQ2, right? We weren't in the top 20. And I think where they did land was actually eventually in Virginia, next to Virginia Tech, building an innovation hub there. They want to be by that pipeline of talent. They want to, so the idea of companies coming in, are those companies that are helping solve these problems ready? Are they big enough? Are they the other ones? How do we welcome them into Detroit and kind of embrace that new future and have this conversation be one that's also economic? And it's also helping people grow those businesses and grow that wealth with not only the technologies but the economic opportunities. I think there's a connection there we don't always make, and it's one we're trying to be very intentional about making, not just in New York with Cornell Tech, but here in Detroit, Michigan now.
Yeah, I think that's a really important underlying point that doesn't always get pulled out. So I appreciate you for highlighting that. So I'm going to give one last question to the full panel, and then we'll see if we've got some questions from the audience. So we've talked a bit about a lot of different angles of sustainable design, but we certainly haven't hit them all. And so I was wondering, Frans, we'll start over there with you. If there's pieces to your projects that you think we haven't pulled out in the course of this conversation that you'd want to make sure we highlight.
A lot of these things are of course integrated, but I think what you of course see in cities, of course, is the enormous decline in biodiversity. And especially urban design is also a way of bringing biodiversity back, and also with buildings. So making sure that we integrate green roofs, making sure that we integrate trees in our streets, that we have enough parks so that there can be biodiversity. I mean, that's one of the things I think that is really important to make sure that we keep on implementing in our new designs, and especially on a larger scale for the city.
Great, thanks, Frans. Ryan, same question.
Yeah, I've said a lot. All I would add is Related has tried to be a national leader on this front. We were the first national developer to commit every single build. This is long ago when this was, leading, but every building we would build would be, LEED Silver minimum. And I think what we're trying to do also in Detroit has been, admittedly behind when it comes to being at the cutting edge of our buildings and sustainability. I think the University of Michigan Center, all the U of M buildings are carbon neutral, LEED Platinum, right? So having that in Detroit and trying to raise that standard as we bring, we also innovate. I think there's a policy component here we haven't talked about. We sit with governments and try and innovate when they are thinking up policies that help building materials, right? There's a whole other kind of topic we can get into there. But I think we've tried to be a leader there and want to try and be a leader in Detroit on that same front now.
Yeah, I'm really excited about the opportunity for the UMCI building and what's going to happen there. So that's going to be really cool. Jonathan, from Gordie Howe perspective, are there components to the bridge that were a sustainability aspect that we haven't drawn out in the course of the discussion today you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, one thing with the actual bridge itself, just the longevity of the bridge itself, the requirement was to build for 125 year life. So it's a crazy amount of time. But I think you need to look at that in respect to buildings, that we should be designing for buildings for long term, just for the durability. And so I think that's an important factor with just buildings in general, that they need to be long term, and so we're not having to rebuild in a few years later, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's an interesting point right now, too, as we're doing so much energy efficiency and retrofitting historical buildings to keep them operational and as low carbon intensity as possible. Matt?
Yeah, so I've been talking quite a bit about some pretty exciting large-scale infrastructure projects that we've been working on to rebuild the shoreline for climate change. But, I think it's a little bit counterintuitive if you plan on pumping all kinds of carbon into the air to put steel and concrete in your shoreline to protect yourself from climate change that's being caused exactly because you're pumping a lot of carbon into the air. So what we've been doing in the latest project in Lower Manhattan, of course, is setting a net zero standard for the project itself. And it's really creates I think a lot of hard questions that the city and the consultant team need to ask themselves about how much and when something should be built, because the most sustainable thing you can do in terms of construction is not build it in some cases. So we've been looking at retrofitting existing buildings, looking to create on-site energy generation, and also working specifically on, if you are going to build this infrastructure, say as concrete, steel, what have you, then what can we do to make that as light of a carbon footprint as possible? Because we're talking about extremely carbon intensive materials and a lot of it. So it's something that's really top of mind when we're in early stages of planning and deciding what gets built and what doesn't get built.
That's such a great point. Franz wants to get back in.
Yeah, I wanted to add to Jonathan, because not only building for longevity, but if you build something, also make sure that you build it demountable. Making sure that if you build something, that you can take it out easily and reuse it. So, because we know structures will stand there for 50, 100 years, but everything that goes in it, make sure that you can take it out and use it in another building at a certain moment. What you said, reducing waste, reducing carbon, these are also, and that's not only that's also in building, but also, of course, on a bigger scale, looking at urbanism.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I've learned a lot from this discussion, but I know we've got experts in this room too. So I want to see if we've got questions from our room for this fabulous panel. And we've got lots of hands going up. I'm going to start right here in the front row.
Hi, I'm Donovan from Creator Connect. My question would be for Mathew. You brought up a great point when you said, you spoke about making sure you stay at net zero. Is there a creative process or a supply chain, maybe rules that you guys have created to stick to make sure that you're staying at net zero, or maybe you can grade yourself if you're close to it?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And maybe the short answer to that is that we're currently working on those rules. But I think that the first step for us was in working with the client, which the City of New York, is to establish at least certain baseline standards in terms of LEED and vision and the kind of benchmarks that we all understand. But then at the same time, recognizing that some of these large urban infrastructure projects, it's really difficult to understand even what the extent of your impact is and how you would quantify the long-term carbon impact of a particular project. So for example, we're working on a master plan that includes 3 new ferry terminals. And so a large question there is, when we're moving towards net zero, of course, we need to be talking to Con Edison, the electric company, to make sure that there's adequate electric service to those new facilities, because all of those ferry terminals will eventually be decarbonized and most likely be using electric. And so it's I guess the short answer of it is it's been more productive to really stay focused on the key principles that we know will be, let's say, move the needle the most for a project, as opposed to, let's say, get locked in particular metrics too early.
That's really interesting. All right, we had some other, sure, let's go back over here. Oh, okay. We'll come over to the woman in the green next. Okay, yeah.
Thank you. Jeremy Waldorf with Shernox. I had just a question. I grew up in the age of reduce, reuse, recycle. I don't think I see enough of the first two a lot of times. In terms of, I guess, from the manufacturing side, what are some of the best ways or advice you'd give for manufacturers of sustainable solutions to be a resource, for all of you during these process of design of these forward-thinking projects? I hope that makes sense.
Anybody want it?
Yeah, sorry, could you repeat it for a moment?
As far as
sorry, yeah, okay. On manufacturing, we see that actually, now, first of all, what you said, reuse, we now see in Holland that we have a couple of demolition companies that harvest buildings, and they really take out the materials, and we have databases where you can see what's available and what you could reuse in your other building. So that's why I also said demountability, thinking about that already when you start building a building is really important. Another thing is, and that's, I would say, and that has to do with technology and innovation, is thinking about how, and we're working with a couple of companies, how can you reuse old materials in a new way? Grind them up, but make sure that you only have to add one thing, and then you have a new material that you can use as facade. There's a company in Holland that actually makes from recycled plastic now facade materials that are aesthetically pleasing. That's important, of course, but also have follow all the regulations that are there.
And last question over here in the green.
Hi, my name is Amanda Page. I'm with Bailey Park Neighborhood Development Corporation. You guys talked about sort of retrofitting older municipals type building. How do we bring that appetite for retrofitting into our neighborhoods? So a lot of time community organizations who want to help residents refinish or refurbish their homes run into a bunch of no's saying, oh, you can't do that because you've got envelope issues. How do we bring that appetite for saving our existing housing stock that has the older building materials that are of better quality, technology or amenities that we just don't see anymore, like the plaster and the beautiful things? How do we save those homes but bring them into the future?
Well, I'm going to take moderator's Oh, was Ryan ready? Okay. I got a little too. So Ryan and I'll tag team. So moderator's prerogative. So I'm very passionate about exactly the topic you put on the table and the challenges that exist there, right? It's not that easy. So we think about, wanting to do more energy efficiency, electrify everything, getting our homes ready for electric vehicles. And some of our beautiful old homes have beautiful old wiring. And even under that plaster, we still have a lot of work to do, right? And so I think there's a few different programs that are helpful here. In particular, Department of Health and Human Services in Michigan is going to be getting additional weatherization dollars from the federal government to the tune of hundreds of millions, which I think is going to be a really big asset working through our community action agencies to help neighborhoods put some of those dollars to work. And then the administration created a bucket of money a couple of years ago that helps homes do the roofing issues first, because in a lot of cases you can't use the weatherization dollars if you haven't dealt with some of the basic structural challenges in the house. So those are not all the answers, but I think those are things that can help seed what we want to see, so that people that are in the older homes are able to take advantage of the clean energy transition and where we're going, but still having those beautiful old homes with the good infrastructure and skeletons.
Liesl created and ran the programs. I was just going to mention the programs. She did or created them, so she's much better to speak to them. All I would add, maybe at a one step higher level, is there's a great conference next week I'll be at Cornell Tech is hosting that's around urban tech, it's called. And urban tech is another one of the degrees U of M will be offering. What urban tech is, to your question, and it have a lot of community groups there, it's the idea of using technology to solve problems that face the urban landscape. And it has community groups thinking about questions like you're raising and listening to those questions and then taking back and saying, all right, how can we take our places like these and address those issues and those topics? And I think the fertile ground that we have here, the strong community networks, right, the building technology infrastructure. There's going to be some people, I think, Johnny Turnage, who hosts the Black Tech Saturdays here every Saturday. Hundreds of people now in Detroit here is tapped into something that's so strong and so powerful between the idea of solving problems that can be unique to a community with the technology that presents, that I think Detroit is getting to the front of the line on. I think Johnny's going to be out there with a few of us. U of M's going to be out there. I think Brian Boyer, Dean Massey. So I just love the question, but the broader context of being able to solve questions like that with places like this and minds like these coming together. So anyway. That's all. Thank you.
I love the question too. Such a good one to close out this panel. So join me in thanking this panel of experts.